Beyond Economics and Back podcast is created by Lithuanian Free Market Institute.
Welcome to the Lithuanian Free Market Institute podcast. My name is Augminas Petronis, and my guest today is Routledge, who is Vice President of Research and Director of the Human Flourishing Lab at Archbridge Institute, and co-editor of Profectus, a magazine on human progress and flourishing. He is a leading expert in psychology. He has published more than 100 academic papers, and he's also author of 3 books, including Past Forward, How Nostalgia Can Help You Live a More Meaningful Life. Mr. Routledge, welcome again, and thank you for joining us again.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So, and it's our second discussion on a universal basic income, an idea that every person in the society should get a fixed and regular sum of money merely for existing. UBI keeps appearing in the public discussions and is presented as both a utopian dream and a dystopian nightmare. We will make 2 podcasts with Mr. Routledge. The one you're watching or listening to now is the second one. And for the first part, if you want to listen or watch the first part, you can find the link in the description. So I want to begin the first part with this article that Yuval Harari, author of this famous history of mankind called Sapiens, he made a suggestion in an essay published on The Guardian. And so his idea is that in the future, most of the people will be pushed out of the labor market by robots and AI. And what the people are going to do, they're just going to sit at home and play video games and get the UBI to sustain themselves. And then Harari makes a comparison with some religious Orthodox Jewish people who live in Israel, and they get money from the government, which finances their lifestyle. And their lifestyle is that they do not work, they're not active in the labor market, they do not seek employment. They just get the money from the government, and they study Bible and the Jewish religion, and their self-reported happiness and all the happiness measures seem to be very, very high. And what Harari says is, look, these people are very, very happy getting money from the government and performing some sort of imaginary quest. And, well, playing video games is another kind of imaginary quest that you can do. And so, going back to the society in the future, according to Harari, video games are exactly the same sort of imaginary quest as religion. So we give people video games and free money, and everybody is going to be happy as never before. And do you buy this?
No. Not at all.
Okay, and can you tell us why? Because as somebody who studied psychology of meaning, you should have a point like that.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'll give him credit for creativity. It's a very creative thought exercise. I spend a lot of time in academia, and it is the type of thing that maybe professors would think was an interesting, thought exercise. But first of all, people who are deeply religious and committed to a faith do not think that they're playing a video game or in an imaginary, quest. Not to mention the fact, I don't know a whole lot about Orthodox Jews in Israel, but I do know about the extensive research on the psychology of religion globally. And it isn't the case that first of all, it isn't the case that people who are deeply committed to a religion are the insular type of people that are just playing, like somebody happy to just sit at home at playing video games. People who are religious tend to be more outgoing. They tend to be more pro-social. They tend to be more involved in their communities. They tend to feel like they actually have a calling to go make a difference in the world and to help others. People who are deeply religious are, and religion is often like a psychological resilience factor, that when life gets difficult, they feel a deep connection to the divine, which helps, even if they're experiencing loneliness in the real world, for example, their connection to the divine helps them kind of meet that need to belong, and gives them kind of the confidence to go forward. And so if you take seriously the large volume of research on the social, psychological, economic, professional, creative, pro-social effects of religion, to compare it to like to compare a video game, to offer video games as a substitute, seems honestly ignorant. I mean, I'm trying to figure out the most polite way to say it, but like, it seems silly. Like, it's, you know what I mean? It seems like an unwillingness to even consider the differences. So I could just start with that point, I guess.
Okay, but like, so you said the main difference between religion and video games is that it gives people a social structure, or does it give, like, games don't give you
Video
psychological?
games, video games don't connect you to a deeper cultural fabric, a sense of continuity, that you're part of a tradition, that you're part of a deep interconnected community. A big dimension of religion, actually, that's often neglected, is self-control. That one of the reasons that people who are deeply religious tend to do well in life, is because they use it as a self-regulatory structure. I actually co-edited, I should say, a handbook on the psychology of religion, and some of the researchers in this space wrote chapters about this. And one proposal which was interesting was that you can think of religion actually almost as a meta choice. It's like, if you to navigate the world, you have to make lots of choices. That can be overwhelming, that can be difficult. If you adopt a certain religious framework, you're making a free choice to adopt that framework, but that framework actually gives you like a blueprint of, so you don't have to think about every single decision. And so it gives you some structure in your life. So video game, yeah, okay. Religion isn't just some quest, like a video game of like you going to try to like defeat a boss or something like that. Like, it's a much more multi-dimensional pursuit. Not to mention the fact that like people believe it. Like, it's not like, I haven't met anyone personally, maybe you have, who thinks the quest in their video game is real. Like, and this isn't to say, to be clear, this isn't to say that non-religious people are not doing these things. It's just that within the psychology of religion, we know that a good portion of the global population subscribes to one of the world's religions, and to be non-religious is actually more anomalous. And we can get into, like, I'm actually kind of interested in what sort of the secularization of the modern world, and sort of what are people really becoming more secular, or are they abandoning one religion and sort of putting their faith in other religious like structures. I know that's not what you're asking, but the point being, it's like, it's not a video game. Like, whether or not you can come up with a good secular substitute, even if you could, that secular substitute wouldn't be a video game, right? It would be some other life project or commitment to a structure of living, a way of living, a way of being, that involves rituals, that involves community, that involves rules, that involves a higher purpose of some. It doesn't have to be one that's supernatural, but that involves some kind of higher purpose. That would be how how you filled the void that left, in the abandonment of religion, not video games. I mean, I just don't. Not to say that people don't find video games, cognitively like fulfilling in some way. Like people like to play video games because it is like a puzzle. It's like solving a problem. It does have some simulation factors that they give you some sense of accomplishment, but that sense of accomplishment is like down here compared to like religion or other sorts of like major like life commitments. And so I think that I found that article, that Guardian article, interesting, like again from like this is an intellectual exercise, thought experiment, but honestly kind of silly in a lot of ways, and a failure to really grapple, using the one example of these Orthodox Jews. It's like that was kind of a weird comparison, without knowing a lot about them. My guess is they don't think they're playing a video game. They don't think they're playing a video game, and that's kind of a weird. That doesn't really, like, what's going on in Israel doesn't scale, and I suspect there's actually some problems associated with that model too, of what these people are getting kind of like a UBI, and not participating in the labor force. I suspect that might be creating some tension within their political system.
Yeah, if we play with this thought experiment a bit, and okay, so let's imagine that this gets implemented. Let's say governments give people free money and tell them just to sit at home and play video games, and then people just find life very, very meaningless, and like, what do you expect? What would you expect them to do if we, let's say, just play with this thought experiment? Like, would you expect them to get like destructive or self-destructive, or would you expect them to find some other kind of meaning in some strange cults, or some as you call it, religion-like structures, like believing in aliens, or horoscopes, or anything like that? Like, if we continue this thought experiment, like, what would you imagine could happen?
I think that they would. I think they would. I think the need for meaning is so powerful that this would be unsatisfactory, and people would start seeking out other ways to find meaning. And it might not be totally unrelated to the, again, continue with this thought experiment. It might not be totally unrelated to the video game experience. So for instance, people are involved in online video game communities, and it might be the case currently, right? And it might be the case that it provides a context to meet people, to form relationships in which the potential meaning isn't coming from the video game, but from the opportunity to make a difference in those people's lives. And so, I think that you would, whether or not that's an ideal environment to do that is a separate question. But I think people would they would be searching desperately for some other way to matter. And the video game might be the broad like framework in which this operates in. I think about like there is a book and a cinematic example of this in the Ready Player One, which I don't know if you're familiar with this book, with this movie. So it's a Steven Spielberg movie based on a book, where essentially in the future people are kind of like just all like on, they're all in the like metaverse, and so they are playing a game. But what's interesting, and there was all these games and social environments and stuff in there. So, you see like people living in not great material conditions, but they can put on their the VR goggles, and they actually have pretty like they're like on treadmills and they've got gloves. It's like pretty interactive. Like if they really feel like they're in this world. But what you find in the and watching the movie, like I actually watched the movie not that long ago. What's interesting about it is like really the way this turned into any kind of meaningful pursuit for these characters was like that was an opportunity to like change the real world. You know what I mean? Like they were they were doing these challenges in the virtual world, making relationships, building teams, doing things in the virtual world to compete against, like this kind of like, I guess, a sort of like evil corporation in the real world. And so really it was just an avenue for them to like make a difference in the world and change the real world in some way. And so I think it would be like that. Like video games might provide if the way we sort of do this online now, like if the way we interface is through technology, it doesn't change the real stakes, right?
Yes, that's what I wanted to say. Like was it a book or movie that you just mentioned?
It's both. Like it's a book. There's a movie. The movie's based on the book. I have not read the book. I've watched the movie.
Yeah, so that's what we do now. We sit with our smartphones, we connect with another, and we try to fight the bosses of this life
Right.
through interacting uh,
Right.
with one another in the social media. Yes, this is so like so because my point is that, well, if, as you say, people, let's say that this search for meaning is such an important driving force, and if people can find it in video games, and this thought experiment that we should expect them to do something like take a mission to prove to everyone that the government is run by reptilian-like creatures, and then pursue this mission with all their energy because this is like their mission or something like that.
Yeah. People will want to make a so well, a couple things. I do think it's the case generally that you might have a decrease in meaning in the sense that if everyone's just playing video games and they don't if we see it another way to think about it, if we people will persevere. There will be people that are like, no, this isn't satisfactory, and I'm going to find like a real meaning in my life. But if we put up the more barriers we put up to meaning, like if we disincentivize going out in the world and making a difference, I do think you will see an increase in depression, lack of meaning, because it'll just be harder. I think it'll be more challenging. But there will be people. The need for meaning is powerful, and over time, I think there will be people that figure out this isn't satisfactory. Not to reference another movie, but did you ever see this movie WALL-E?
Oh yes.
That's kind of another good example. It's like eventually, like, what was the end result? Like people figured out like, oh, like us just being taken care of by this like computer, by all this automation wasn't really what was going to be the most fulfilling. And they sort of rediscovered their capacity, right? Their agency, their ability to it's been a long time since I've seen that movie, but isn't that kind of the basic theme is to reject the passive lifestyle and to like re-exert control.
Yes, and in the end of the Wall-E movie, people go back to Earth and try to rebuild it.
Yeah. So I think I mean, I just think that that's not like having people subdued by video games and UBI is not really an accurate understanding of human nature at scale.
Mhm. You have already mentioned this, but let's go to this now. There is this, okay, so there are two sides that are both pushing for the UBI, and one is the, let's say, center or left of center, which says that UBI should be implemented together with keeping all the welfare programs that we have now, probably with reducing the working hours So this is called the post-work movement. And then there is a libertarian side, which is a bit quieter, but which has its own arguments. And this main argument is that just giving people money would be more cost efficient than having all these welfare programs that we have now that are very hard to administer, that have huge costs just to have people who run them and so on. And it would be much simpler if the government would just simply give people money instead of doing all the complicated stuff like healthcare, retirement fees, and that kind of thing. So you said in one of the podcasts of yours that I've listened to that you lean to the libertarian side. Do you find this kind of argument to be persuasive in one way or another?
No, because I think that so on the libertarian side, I suppose it's true that by definition, it's true that it would be simpler if you could deconstruct the bureaucratic welfare state and just give people money, then that is simpler in the short term. And the reason I say in the short term is because I think what would be quickly discovered is that the welfare system would be built back up. You could deconstruct it, but over time you would start to see, again, like it's not like the libertarians would just control society for for eternity. You would see lots of problems, I think, and you'd see, a push from, so when, for instance, if you just give people money, and there's parents who aren't spending that money on making sure their kids have clothes for school or food or things like that, then you would understandably have a push from the other side of politics saying, well, we need to rebuild the programs that make sure kids get free lunches and that they have health care and that they have, and just as one example. And so I think one of the challenges with the libertarian argument is it also, kind of like the previous point about video games, it also is kind of sort of an academic exercise in the sense that it's not how real people operate in the real world. Yes, there would be people. So remember, universal means everyone gets the money, right? It's not needs based. There would be people that if you gave them $1,000 a month would absolutely use that money wisely to improve their life. And they, some people would just invest it and make some interest. Other people, it would help them pursue, hobbies, or, some people it would even, it would help them meet some basic needs, no doubt. But I actually worked in, before going to pursue my PhD, after I finished my psychology degree, I spent a couple of years working in, social services, both in terms of outpatient mental health, but also in terms of in these sort of economic services. And one of the things that I noticed, and a lot of people have noticed, is there's a lot of people in need that don't have skills, that don't, if you just gave them money, would not know the best way to use it the most. And so somebody on the left would say, okay, we have, understandably would say, okay, we can't just give people this UBI. We have to teach them, we have to provide educational opportunities and training opportunities. So again, I think you'd start to see built up the system again. Not to, of course, we're not talking about, because we're not talking about the economic side of things. We're not talking about the unaffordability of this. But I think that on the libertarian side, they often, it's a simple solution in their mind, it's a simple solution, but it's actually very complex. It's actually a very complex problem. And a lot of people, and again, in my experience working in this sector, a lot of people need training, they need connections, they need, they need culture, they need they need to learn a certain amount of self-regulatory skills. They need educational opportunities. They need good models. And like just throwing money at them isn't gonna help them build a life. At some simple level, I guess you could say it's going to reduce poverty in this, but by design, in the sense that, like, well, now we can say everyone has this amount of money, and if you just measure poverty by how much money people have, of course you're reducing poverty. But that's kind of an economic trick, that's not really saying, well, are these people actually improving their lives in meaningful ways? And so I think on the libertarian, I understand that libertarian sentiment. And part of that sentiment too comes from not just reducing, I should say too, like you talked about removing the bureaucracy. Part of it also comes from the philosophical position of we don't want the government telling people what to do, right? So there's this sense of freedom too, like give them the money and let them be free. But it's like saying, giving it's like saying going to I'm going to use the gym, going to the gym as an example. It's like saying, here's a free gym membership. Go to the gym, and maybe you don't know how to do any exercise, but that's not our problem. Maybe you don't know the proper way to do the physical training, but like you've got the free gym membership, you're free to, as opposed to, there are some people that really maybe what they need is a personal trainer, right? They need somebody to say, here's how you do these exercises, here you do this, and here's how you're going to reach your fitness goal so you don't get injured, so you're actually making progress. And so I think that it's, there's more complexity to just like, give people the freedom to do something, and neglect that. Well, a lot of the reasons that like successful libertarians have this sense of autonomy and freedom is because they've had a lot of inputs in their life that have helped them cultivate those skills, their education, previous job experience, family environment, a lot of the other things that we've talked about that can't be substituted by just giving people money. And yeah, it is more complicated to do targeted, like complex, like interventions. But I think that the thinking that we can just, and those things are corrupt sometimes, and they don't work sometimes, and there is a lot of bureaucracy, but thinking that the solution to those problems is UBI, I think, is misguided.
Yes, I think that probably there are, well, in a way, this could be framed as like there are two sides on the argument. And one side says that we shouldn't give people money, and we should just, we shouldn't give people free money, and we should let people take care of their lives by themselves. And there is another side which says, well, let's just give people money and don't say to them what they are supposed to do with the money. And both of those sides seem to think that another side is paternalistic in a way, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
this sort of let's give people money and not tell them what to do with it is individualistic. And I think maybe that's why it appeals to some people who lean libertarian, let's say.
Yeah, I think so. But it's also, what I would say to those people is, that's a very like short term, or like very proximal view of paternalism, in the sense that, like, if you just give people money and you don't tell them what to do with it, well, if they don't know how to use that money in a way that will help them flourish to where they don't need government support, then you just put yourself back in a situation where now you have people that don't know what to do. And so the idea of we talk about this in education. Kids aren't free to, kids have to obey their teachers, right? Like, kids aren't just like, you can do whatever you want. We're not here to tell you, the idea is that the idea of development, of education, of training, of mentorship is like people, other people like guiding you, teaching you, instructing you, helping you develop the skills and the characteristics so you can be an independent, free person. It requires training. Freedom without that kind of discipline, without that, the ability to use that freedom, is chaotic. Right? It's not, like you would, like a child, like we would say they're feral, right? Like if they didn't have some kind of paternalistic, for lack of a better way of like structure in which like teaching them, how to be civilized, right? How to function socially, how to control their impulses, how to understand how to make decisions. I mean, these are all things that require require training and mentorship. And so I think that it's worth keeping in mind that, and not just when you're a kid, when you're, adults have mentors too. Like adults have things, forces acting on them that help them like develop and become better people and more successful people. So I think, again, I'm sympathetic to that position. I'm very, very sympathetic to libertarianism, and I think that we should be very concerned, or we should be vigilant against paternalism and against the state controlling people, or like strongly like guiding people. I totally understand all that, but I think that's a separate issue from, well, what's it take to help develop a citizenry? What's it to help develop people to where they don't where they don't turn to the state, where they don't, you could honestly create a situation in which people don't have, where they, like your previous example of the Soviet Union, people don't know how to function out and and so they become more like, oh, like we need the government now, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. And what do you think about this sort of entitlement mindset? Like, if you know what I mean, like this people making, and they make this kind of arguments for UBI, but also
Hmm.
arguments for shorter working week, shorter, like,
Yeah.
I don't know, higher minimum wages.
Yeah.
Sort of argument that, well, we are entitled to better things because we are human beings, and so human beings have rights, and we are entitled to get stuff free from those who are more successful than us. Because, well, why not? We are, and and yes, what's your opinion on this as a psychologist? Because I think that, like, many people would make a point that we have sort of a surge of, if that's the right word, of entitlement mindset in the Western societies.
Yeah.
That's the case.
Yeah. Yeah. I think so. And the problem with one of the things that's interesting about entitlement is there is some research on, like the kind of selfishness of like how, and that sort of breeds a certain like selfishness. So for instance, there's research on like victimhood mindset. So if you put people in situations in which they feel like they've been victimized in some way, or they feel like they're a victim, it increases their sense of entitlement, which increases the likelihood that they'll behave selfishly. So it's kind of funny because you often think people often frame. I think in the West you often see people frame anti-capitalist sort of people like frame capitalism as a like selfish like system, right? Like people are just trying to hoard they're just trying to be greedy and hoard resources. And you see free market advocates being better at sort of understanding, well, actually capitalism, you have to like build a market, like you have to like, you have to trade, you have to interact with people, you have to develop these sorts of relationships. And so in a lot of ways it's a more it's it's greed, I guess, in the sense that you want to make, you want to succeed, you want to be profitable. but it's not like a selfishness. Like it's a like I've got to develop a product or a service or something that feeds a market need, and I've got to be in the game, in the social game of interacting with people and building their trust and all of that. What's interesting is the flip side of that is when people feel like, well, no, I don't have to do that stuff. I'm entitled to, like, the government should give me stuff. That actually makes people more selfish. That actually pushes people away from like, oh, I've got to get along with other people. I've got to work to find compromise. I've got to do things that serve others in some ways. It shifts that sort of focused, that incentive structure away from that like outward oriented, I've got to participate in the labor market, I've got to participate in my community, to how to, from what do I do to do that, to participate into that, what is owed to me. And that creates like the psychology of like a more withdrawn, like selfishness, I think.
Yeah, I like what you said about capitalism and selfishness, because I never lived under Soviet communism, but both of
Mhm.
my parents grew up in the Soviet Union, and all of my grandparents lived in the Soviet system. And I think what was characteristic of, let's say, the Soviet culture was extreme selfishness,
Mhm.
and people having the sense that, stealing from government is not exactly morally wrong.
Mhm.
And because we cannot buy stuff because we live under Soviet communism, so there was a problem that there are not enough things that are produced because,
Mhm.
because of the planned economy, and then you cannot get, like, you want to build I don't know, a small house in your garden or something like that, and then the only way to get stuff to do that is to steal.
Mhm.
And people would become extremely tolerant of stealing, and stealing is like, it's not very, like, I don't know, yes, stealing is selfish.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
yeah, you see my point. So yes, I think
Yeah.
that relates to what you said. Yes. So before we finish, I wanted to
Mhm.
ask you this. So in our institute, the Lithuanian Institute of Free Market, we have these discussions in the UBI, and I've noticed that we have this sort of tendency to think of it as a, let's say, civilizational threat,
Mm.
something that can have terrible consequences. And if it is implemented, it would be very, very hard to get rid of it.
Mhm.
And but then sometimes when we talk, we think about the question whether or not we're maybe overemphasizing the threat.
Mm.
So yes, maybe I'm sure there is no like psychological study on this, but if you could
Mhm.
speculate a bit, do you think UBI is a civilizational threat, or is just like another strange idea, another strange utopia that has popped up, and
Yeah.
like that
Yeah.
have been popping up in the public sphere of the West, like for hundreds of years? So what's your opinion on that?
Yeah. No, I mean it is a good point to take a historical context. I mean, these ideas have been in various names and versions have been around a while. I think even in the US before the recent like UBI, like experiments, I think we had like a negative income tax experiment. Maybe it was like in the 70s or 80s. So these ideas have popped up a lot under different names and terminology. And I guess where I would, maybe this will give you some comfort. Like, I guess where I wouldn't, at least, so maybe in different countries it's more of a threat than others. I mean, you're talking about like a post-Soviet like country. Maybe there's more of a vulnerability. In the United States, it doesn't seem like a civilizational threat just because it's, like it seems no matter how much like venture capitalists seem to want to put into these like little experiments, like I don't see any real traction. At least currently, the sentiment among Americans is like, you know, is negative against these ideas. People don't, as a general rule, regardless of politics, with a few extremes on the like far left and maybe the far libertarian, extreme libertarians. Most people don't think this is a good idea. They think that we already have a massive like deficit. If we're going to be spending money on things, it should be very surgical. It shouldn't be like everyone gets $1,000 a month. Post-pandemic, I think we've seen, more concerns about because the government did send everyone checks in the United States. And again, I'm not an economist, but from what I understand, there is at least some consensus that at least partially contributed to inflation. And so I think from the economic point of view, there are people like, well, this would be inflationary if we just start giving everyone free money. So I don't think it's a big threat. When we were talking about the Harari article in The Guardian, like I forgot to mention, because I was so focused on the ridiculousness of comparing video games to religion, didn't mention the other like thing about like how there's not going to be any jobs in the future. So that's another argument for the UBI, is that we're going to become like this automated world control, like run by robots. That's so sci-fi, that's so distant. That possibility seems so remote at this point. In fact, if anything, we have the opposite problem. Like people are actually demanding, we want more robots because we don't have enough workers. Like people are, it's not like people can't find work. We can't find workers. And so, you're seeing more investment and efforts to really figure out like autonomous trucking, because we have a shortage of truck drivers. And there always seems, at least a history of this stuff, is new technology, automation always like creates new jobs and services. And so I think that side of it too is not the existential threat. I would be more, like I said at the very beginning, I try to be open-minded about UBI, even though my bias is against it, because I'm like, well, it's interesting to hear different proposals. And hypothetically, you could imagine in some abstract future, a situation in which there's not work. Okay, when that world emerges, let's have a conversation about how to, a need for a new economic system. But that's not our reality right now. Even in rich countries like the United States, where we would be potentially closer to having the wealth to have like a very technologically driven automated society, that's not our problem. We don't have enough workers. That's our problem. There's a lot of things that are, that seem like it would be hard. We're far away from robots doing a lot of the work that, we're far away from a robot being able to come over and do the electrical wiring for my house. You know what I mean? Like we need electricians, we need plumbers. We need, and these are occupations in which people can gain a lot of pride, can feel like they're making meaningful contributions, can fulfill a lot of their needs and interests. And so I think that we're far away from any utopian sort of vision of like what some people have proposed as like some kind of odd luxury communism where people don't need to work because we're so technologically advanced. That's not going to happen anytime soon. I doubt it'll happen at all. And so I don't find that's a fun academic, I like, this is a fun like intellectual exercise, but it's not a serious one. Even in the wealthiest countries, the problems are much more surgical. And the idea, like we're focused on at Archbridge Institute, should be like, well, what are the best ways to help people have equal opportunity, so they can develop the skills, the work experience, to build a life. And there are important arguments to be had on different sides of politics on this, of what's the best way to do these programs. But I don't think UBI doesn't seem to be a serious contender in that debate, at least in the United States. It is really more of like what, well-intentioned people on conservatives, liberals, progressives, on all sides of politics. Really, I think there are lots of people in these different spaces with different philosophical positions that are very sincerely like more surgically focused on things like occupational licensing or things that are very specific barriers to flourishing. And I think that's where the focus should largely be maintained. UBI is a fun thing to talk about, but it doesn't seem to be a civilizational threat, at least here. Like I can't, I'd be curious about what's going on in other countries, but I don't think it's a civilizational threat in the U.S.
No, I think in the post-Soviet sphere, we're going to do anything that the Americans do. So if you do it, then we're likely to do it, and if you don't do it, then we're likely not to. Okay, Mr. Routledge.
But you're right. I think you're right. Like we need to be vigilant. Like so, your concern, your panic about it. There is value in being vigilant about these things, right? And like reminding. It's easy to sort of forget what built our flourishing societies, and so I think it's good. But yeah, I don't think it's the most immediate civilizational threat by any means.
All right, so I think we can finish this. Mr. Routledge, thank you very much again for appearing on the Lithuanian Free Market Institute podcast. This was the second part of our discussion. For those who want to watch the first video or listen to the first record, you can go and find the link in the description. And thank you again, and goodbye.
Thank you so much.